Hola, what's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
Some people just aren't cut out for tech, my brother Aaron announced with that trademark smugness that made me want to shove the turkey legs straight down his condescending throat. His voice rang out, unnecessarily loud, across the table, as if he wanted the entire family to hear, to absorb, to nod in agreement. He didn't even glance in my direction as he said it, which somehow made it worse, like I wasn't even worth looking at while he fired off his little grenade. The worst part? He said it with the same casual cruelty you use when talking about the weather, like it was a simple fact, like he'd just observed it raining outside and decided to point it out. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. My jaw clenched involuntarily, and I felt the familiar heat rise to my ears, the kind that always shows up when humiliation hits, before you even get a chance to fight back. My daughter Lily, seated quietly next to me, shifted slightly in her seat, sensing the tension like a deer hearing a twig snap. And Aaron was already back to carving his ham with a level of aggressive precision that made me wonder how many spreadsheets and underpaid interns he'd terrorized that week. But before I could collect my thoughts, before I could form any kind of measured or even sarcastic comeback, Grandma Helen, seated at the head of the table like some ancient queen who'd seen 100 family battles and still kept score, set her wineglass down and tilted her head toward me, her eyes narrowed but twinkling in that dangerous way they do when she's about to ruin someone's entire week. And with a voice calm as ever, just loud enough for everyone to hear, she asked, "Didn't your company just buy his?" The effect was immediate. You know that sound when a crowded restaurant suddenly goes silent during an argument? Multiply that by 10 and sprinkle in 3 generations of suppressed resentment. Aaron froze mid-bite, his fork halfway to his mouth, and I swear to God my cousin Shannon dropped her wine glass. No one moved. No one blinked. For a moment I thought even the ceiling fan had stopped spinning. All eyes turned to me, except Aaron's. His stayed locked on his plate like maybe if he didn't look up, the bomb wouldn't have gone off. Now, let me pause right here and ask you, have you ever sat through a moment like that, where someone who spent years undermining you, talking over you, treating you like you're some charity case with a laptop, suddenly finds out that the ground he's been standing on all this time belongs to you? I know this sounds petty, and maybe it is, but let's be honest. If someone you love has spent their whole life trying to make you feel small, what would you do if you finally had the chance to flip the script without even opening your mouth? See, Aaron's jab wasn't just about tech. It was layered, dipped in years of sibling power plays and family dynamics that should have died off in childhood, but somehow just evolved with better vocabulary. He was always the one our parents believed in. He had the grades, the charm, the job at a real company, whatever that meant. When I left my job 6 years ago, during my messy divorce, and said I was going to start something of my own, the silence on the family group chat lasted almost 3 full weeks. My mom asked if I'd maybe take some night classes. Aaron offered to help me with my resume, just in case. They didn't mean harm, not directly, that's what made it worse. No one took me seriously, not then, not now, apparently, except Grandma Helen. God bless that 90-year-old firecracker who still knew how to pull a pin when she felt like it. Her question wasn't a mistake. It wasn't senility, it was a precision strike. Because she knew, she had known for a while. Maybe not all the details, but enough. She was the only one I ever confided in when things started taking off. And now, apparently, she decided the time had come to light a match and see what burned. I glanced around the table, unsure of whether to smile, stay quiet, or lean in. But Aaron beat me to it. He finally looked up. His eyes locked with mine for the first time in over a year. And in that one glance, I saw it all. Confusion, suspicion, denial. He wanted to ask. He wanted to dismiss it as a joke. But he couldn't. Because he knew Helen didn't joke. Not like that. And I didn't deny it. I didn't confirm it either. I just leaned back in my chair, dabbed the corner of my mouth with my napkin, like I'd just tasted the juiciest piece of gossip, and said nothing. Which, of course, made it worse. Aaron's wife, who had been scrolling through her phone for most of dinner, now looked up with wide eyes like she had accidentally tuned into the season finale of a family drama she didn't know she'd been starring in. My mom cleared her throat and tried to change the subject, something about the new landscaping in her backyard, but it was useless. The silence had shape now, it had teeth, and everyone knew it. Aaron finally spoke, but his voice had lost that easy arrogance. Now it was tight, careful. "What's she talking about?" I shrugged. "It's complicated," I said simply and reached for my wine. And that's how it started. Not with a press release, not with a handshake or a courtroom or a buyout announcement. Just dinner, just one loud comment, one quiet truth, and one bombshell grandma waiting for the perfect moment to drop it. And believe me, this was just the beginning. It's strange how a single moment can define you, not the kind of moment you put in a photo album or post about online, but the kind that breaks something inside you so deeply it forces you to rebuild, quietly, piece by piece, in the kind of silence most people mistake for weakness. The moment for me didn't happen at a family dinner or inside a boardroom. It happened in the middle of the night, in a half-empty house, after my husband of 15 years packed his bags, said something vague about needing space to find himself, and walked out the front door without even taking his toothbrush. There was no fight, no dramatic last stand, just the slow burn of someone deciding you're not enough and having the nerve to act like it's a personal journey rather than betrayal. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen where my daughter Lily sat cross-legged on the tile floor, eating dry cereal out of the box, and asked if she wanted to help me take down the wedding photos. She didn't say anything, just nodded, and for the next 2 hours we tore memories off the walls, while the silence between us grew more sacred than any words we could have said. The divorce papers came quickly, as if he'd been planning it longer than I had known, and while he moved in with his 26-year-old coworker, someone who wore crop tops to pitch meetings and spelled client with a K for branding reasons, I was left to divide the furniture and try to explain to Lily why her dad suddenly had a cool downtown loft. I didn't cry, at least not where anyone could see. Instead, I downloaded a free coding platform one night while drinking wine straight from the bottle, stared at the glowing screen for almost an hour, and whispered to no one, "Let's just see what happens." What happened was obsession, or maybe survival, depending on how you look at it. I dove into code like it was the only way to stay afloat, relearning things I hadn't touched since my early 20s when I'd first started out as a junior developer before giving it up to focus on family, which in hindsight was a polite way of saying I put myself on hold so my husband could rise faster. I worked in the basement, on an old desktop we almost donated during spring cleaning, surrounded by dusty boxes of baby clothes and tax receipts. During the day, I did freelance web development for local businesses, mostly dentists and real estate agents who paid just enough to cover groceries. At night, I built something else, something I didn't have a name for yet, something that made my heart race, not because it was working, but because it might work. I didn't tell anyone, not my ma, who still thought I was between jobs, and definitely not Aaron, who occasionally texted things like, "Need help with a resume?" as if my life were a temporary inconvenience rather than a personal reinvention. The truth is, no one took me seriously, and honestly, I didn't blame them. When people see you fall apart, they rarely stick around long enough to see you rebuild. They assume that collapse is permanent, that broken people stay broken, especially if they're over 35 and female and living in a zip code that screams suburbia more than startup. But that's the thing about being underestimated. It creates a vacuum of doubt you can fill with whatever the hell you want. I filled mine with lines of code, late-night research, failed beta launches, cheap coffee, and quiet rage. It took 2 years to build the first prototype, another 6 months to find the right developer to partner with, and almost a year after that to land the first real client. An education company that was too broke to pay up front, but desperate enough to try something new. I made them a deal. Let me run the back end for free for 3 months, and if it works, we negotiate. Not only did it work, It doubled their user retention and gave me leverage to start pitching the same solution to their competitors. Word spread slowly, but it spread. And within 18 months, I had 5 clients, a growing team of contractors, and a product that did something no one else in the market had quite figured out how to do. I called it Level, short for leveling the playing field, and only one person in my life knew how deep that name really went. Grandma Helen, who during one of her Sunday tea visits asked how the project was going, and then listened, really listened, as I explained the stack, the roadmap, and the next steps. She didn't interrupt, she didn't nod politely. She leaned in and said, "Don't tell anyone yet, not until it's undeniable." And I took that to heart. Meanwhile, Aaron was still coasting at his firm, some medium-sized tech consulting company that had been chasing IPO status for a decade without ever quite making it past regional relevance. He gave talks at Rotary clubs, posted inspirational quotes on LinkedIn, and casually mentioned quarterly strategy in conversations like it was some kind of personal brand. He had no idea what I was building. No one did, which was exactly how I wanted it. Because sometimes, when the world thinks you've disappeared, it gives you the perfect cover to become something no one saw coming. And I was coming. Quietly, but I was coming. There's a moment somewhere between obscurity and recognition when the tides begin to turn, not in the dramatic made-for-television way where everyone suddenly knows your name and your inbox overflows with congratulations, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible shift of power you can feel long before anyone else notices it, like the tightening of a storm that hasn't quite broken but hums in the air around you with growing certainty. That moment came for me on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday morning when I received an email from a recruiter whose name I didn't recognize, asking if Level would be open to acquisition conversations. Not with a VC firm, not with a Silicon Valley giant, but with a regional tech services company that sounded eerily familiar. At first, I laughed, not because I didn't take it seriously, but because the sender didn't realize the poetic irony of who they were actually contacting. The company's name, Neuroflux, had been tossed around in family conversations for years, usually attached to Aaron's name with an eye roll or a sigh, depending on who was talking. This was his company, the same company he bragged about endlessly at Thanksgiving, the same one he once said would revolutionize cloud access architecture, even though no one at the table knew what the hell that meant. Including, I suspected, Aaron himself. What the recruiter didn't know, and what I suspected Aaron didn't know either, was that Neuroflux had been slowly bleeding talent over the last 18 months. Through quiet whispers, carefully constructed NDAs, and a reputation that spread quietly through developer communities like wildfire Level, had become a haven for engineers tired of bureaucratic nonsense and bloated middle management, both of which happened to be Neuroflux's most defining features. I didn't poach intentionally. I didn't have to. Word got out that we moved fast, paid fairly, and didn't tolerate performative nonsense. People came to us, not because we were flashy or offered beer on tap or mandatory meditation hours, but because we respected skill over pedigree and built things that actually worked. By the time I got that email, I already had 3 ex-Neuroflux developers on payroll. Brilliant, underutilized minds who only needed one chance to breathe without someone like my brother breathing down their neck. I didn't respond to the email right away. I sat with it, letting the potential weight of it settle in my chest like a warm stone. Because what they were really asking, even if they didn't know it yet, was whether I wanted to buy the company where my brother had built his entire identity. And that's not a question you answer quickly. That's a question that demands strategy, restraint, and a little bit of vengeance disguised as professionalism. Over the next few weeks, I played it slow. I responded with polite interest, scheduled initial calls through a proxy CEO I had hired just months earlier to manage our external negotiations, and made damn sure my name never once appeared on any official documents. I wasn't being petty. I was being surgical. The acquisition wasn't personal, not outwardly, but I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a certain electricity in knowing that each call brought me closer to the moment when Aaron would have to sit in a boardroom, look across the table, and realize that the company swallowing his wasn't just a competitor, it was mine. The more we dug into Neuroflux's books, the more obvious it became that they were in trouble. The user retention numbers were dismal, project delays were stacked like firewood, and investor patience was thinning like bad hair. They needed out, or at least a lifeline, and Level, with its clean infrastructure, loyal team, and steadily growing client base, looked like exactly the kind of partner that could absorb the mess and spin it into something new. Except we weren't interested in partnering, we were interested in consuming. Still, I kept things cordial. The key to a good takedown, I've learned, is never letting your target see it coming. We offered a generous buyout, folded in non-compete clauses so tight you'd need a crowbar to pry them open, and ensured that existing management, Aaron included, would be off-boarded after a short transitionary period. It was, as the documents would later say, a strategic integration. I watched the process unfold like a chess game I'd been playing for years, except this time I was 10 moves ahead and holding the board. The final paperwork was signed on a Monday, with little fanfare and even less resistance. Aaron, I later learned, hadn't even been looped into the last phase of negotiations. He found out the day before the internal announcement was scheduled. Someone had forwarded him a PDF by accident, or on purpose, depending on whose story you believe, and by then it was too late. The board had approved the deal, the ink was dry, the future was already in motion. I didn't show up to the final call. I let my proxy handle the optics. But I did watch the recording afterward, just once, late at night, with a glass of bourbon in hand, and Lily fast asleep upstairs. Aaron looked tired, not devastated, not broken, just small, smaller than I'd ever seen him. His eyes darted around the screen like he was still trying to find a way to spin it, to salvage some kind of dignity from the wreckage. He thanked the team. He smiled through clenched teeth. He said he was looking forward to new opportunities. And if you didn't know the backstory, you might have even believed him. But I knew, and Grandma Helen knew. And somewhere deep down, even Aaron probably knew, because this wasn't just business. This was the moment the game changed. And it was far from over. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from lack of sound, but from the utter stillness of everything around you when reality hits so hard, so suddenly, it seems to flatten the air itself. And that's exactly the silence I imagined blanketing Aaron's corner office the moment he opened that forwarded PDF. The one not meant for his eyes. The one that outlined the final acquisition terms in language clinical enough to disguise its deeper truth, but precise enough to crush any hope of misinterpretation. I wasn't there when he read it, obviously. I had long since removed myself from the front-facing parts of Level's negotiations, choosing instead to act from the shadows, from the quiet power of knowing more than the person sitting across from the table. But I could see it, clear as a movie I'd already watched 100 times. Aaron's fingers freezing on the keyboard, his jaw tightening as his eyes scanned the words again and again, hoping, praying perhaps, that his brain had misread what his heart already understood. Because it wasn't just about the sale. It wasn't even about losing control of the company he'd wrapped his identity around for the better part of a decade. No, what gutted him, what carved something deep and permanent into the foundation of his ego, was the name buried in the fine print of the ownership chain, the one he hadn't seen in any of the early calls or documents, the one he never suspected because, in his mind, I was still just his younger sister trying to figure things out in her garage like some overgrown teenager who'd never quite grown out of her college hoodie. The realization that it had been me all along, that I was the architect of his downfall, the woman behind the brand that now held the deed to everything he'd once used to measure his worth, must have landed like a punch from a hand he never saw coming. The fallout began immediately, not with confrontation but with whispers. People talk in times of transition, especially when there's fear in the air. And Aaron's team, those who hadn't already fled for better, leaner pastures, started sharing the news through Slack threads and hallway glances. By the time the internal email went out, announcing the acquisition and the leadership changes. The staff already knew who was leaving and who was staying. Aaron tried to maintain control, of course. He called meetings, sent long-winded updates, tried to spin the whole thing as a strategic evolution, but it was like watching a ship's captain give a motivational speech as the water reached his knees. There was no saving face. The only thing left was damage control. He called me 3 days later. I let it go to voicemail, not because I didn't want to hear what he had to say, but because I already knew, and somehow listening to his voice, hearing the defeat laced beneath the polished tone he used for investors and family barbecues alike, felt like a level of intimacy I wasn't ready to grant him. Not yet. He didn't leave a long message, just said he needed to talk, and left his number, as if I didn't already have it memorized from years of emergency contacts and family plans. I listened to it once, then deleted it. Not out of malice, but because I didn't want anything to dull the edge of what I'd done. He needed to sit in it a while. He needed to feel the full weight of what it meant to be underestimated, dismissed, and finally replaced. What most people don't understand is that revenge, real, slow-burning, deeply personal revenge, isn't about gloating or screaming "I told you so" in someone's face. It's about patience. It's about crafting something so complete, so undeniable, that by the time your target realizes what's happened, all they can do is marvel at your precision. And I had been precise. Every hire, every partnership, every line of code, intentional. I didn't build level to destroy Aaron, but once the opportunity presented itself, I didn't hesitate to lean into the poetic symmetry of it all. Grandma Helen called me the next evening. She didn't ask questions or congratulate me like someone who'd picked the winning horse. She simply said, "So he knows now," and I said, "Yes, he knows." And we sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that doesn't beg to be filled, but feels like acknowledgement, like a handshake without the touch. She didn't gloat either. She just said, "I hope it was worth it," and hung up, leaving me to wonder whether she meant the company, the revenge, or the years I'd poured into both. The next time I saw Aaron in person was at a post-acquisition meeting, the kind companies host to unify culture, but which really just function as funerals for the old regime. He walked in late, avoided eye contact, and sat in the back while the new leadership team, my team, outlined the vision moving forward. When it was over, he stood, smoothed his shirt like it might make him look more in control than he felt, and walked over to me with the tightest smile I'd ever seen on his face. "You really did it," he said, no venom in his tone, just fatigue, maybe a little admiration, but mostly confusion, like he still hadn't pieced together the version of me that could pull this off. "I told you I was working on something," I said, not bothering to soften the truth. He nodded, then paused, eyes narrowing just slightly. "You waited a long time to play this card." I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him it wasn't a card. It was the whole damn deck, shuffled and dealt and played one hand at a time until the game was mine. Instead, I just smiled, because the day he found out wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of him seeing what I'd become. It was almost laughable, in that dark, poetic way life tends to arrange itself, that after everything, after the deals were signed, after the handovers were completed, after the last round of press releases delicately avoided mentioning the real reason behind Neuroflux's collapse, we all found ourselves sitting around the same damn table again, as if nothing had changed, as if the air wasn't thick with the weight of things unsaid and truths too sharp to speak aloud without drawing blood. Thanksgiving came back around like a ticking clock that had finally completed its full rotation. And despite the seismic shifts in every direction of my life, my career, my self-respect, my bank account, I was still asked to bring the mashed potatoes, still expected to smile politely at jokes I'd heard 100 times, and still seated directly across from Aaron, whose eyes had the dull, guarded look of a man trying to pretend he hadn't been gutted. There's a cruelty in how family traditions endure in the face of personal revolutions, how the rituals continue, stubborn and unbothered, as if the emotional tectonics beneath them haven't split everything in half. Aaron was quiet this year, his jokes muted, his usual self-assured commentary replaced with short nods and the occasional sip from a glass that never stayed full for long. His wife, stiff in her seat, barely spoke at all, her smile stretched too thin, too forced, like she hadn't yet figured out how to support a man whose entire identity had been publicly rearranged. The room buzzed with forced cheer, and the clatter of cutlery became the soundtrack to a silence that felt louder than any argument we'd ever had. And then, just like last year, just like some cursed déjà vu with better lighting and worse tension, Aaron decided to speak. "I guess," he said slowly, deliberately, like he was chewing the words before releasing them. "Not everyone can handle success when it comes too fast." It was a strange comment, ambiguous enough to confuse the people not paying attention, sharp enough to be recognized by the ones who knew, but he didn't look at anyone in particular when he said it, choosing instead to stare down at his plate, the tip of his knife tracing invisible patterns on the porcelain, as if that might distract from the bitterness tucked into each syllable. I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't have something to say. I had an entire monologue rehearsed in my head, one that started with a grin and ended with a well-placed truth bomb. But because I had learned, through years of humiliation and quiet plotting, that timing is everything. And this moment, though heavy with potential, wasn't mine to claim just yet. It was Grandma Helen again, same as before, same knowing look in her eyes, same ability to aim a sentence like a loaded gun without ever raising her voice. "Strange thing," she said, tilting her wine glass in the direction of the candlelight. "How success always looks like arrogance when it comes from a woman who didn't ask anyone's permission." The silence that followed was immediate and total, the kind that wraps around a room like a shroud and dares anyone to breathe too loudly. Aaron shifted in his seat, his jaw working like he wanted to speak, but the words had abandoned him, gone rogue somewhere between the thought and the tongue. I leaned back, watching him struggle with a mixture of triumph and something colder, regret maybe, or a kind of sadness I hadn't expected to feel in this final chapter. Because the truth was, I'd won. I'd played the long game. I'd built something from nothing, outmaneuvered someone who had every advantage, and reclaimed a power that had been denied to me my entire life. But sitting there, across from the brother who used to teach me how to ride a bike, who used to sneak me candy when Mom wasn't looking, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't quite guilt, but lived somewhere nearby. He looked up finally, and when our eyes met, I saw none of the disdain, none of the pride, just a tired resignation, like he had finally stopped fighting the current and was just letting himself drift. And maybe that was the moment I should have softened, should have reached across the table, offered something that resembled peace, but I didn't. Because what he never understood, what so many people still don't understand, is that silence is not surrender, and patience is not weakness, and being underestimated is the most dangerous gift you can give a woman like me. So instead I smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a gloating one, just the smile of someone who no longer needed validation, who had nothing left to prove, and everything left to protect. Because the company, the success, the revenge, all of it meant nothing if I let it turn me into a mirror of the man who once tried to laugh at my ambition across this very table. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and overcooked pie. Aaron barely spoke again. I helped Lily load the dishwasher while Grandma Helen smoked a cigarette on the porch, claiming it was her only vice, despite the bourbon on her breath and the razor-edge wisdom in her tongue. Later that night, long after everyone had left and the leftovers were packed into containers no one would ever return, I sat in the quiet of my living room, barefoot and tired, wondering, not for the first time, if I'd gone too far. Had I built something beautiful just to prove a point? Had I buried a relationship in the pursuit of a legacy? Or had I simply taken back what was always mine? The answers didn't come, not that night, maybe not ever, because the truth about revenge is that it never really ends. It lingers long after the game is won, asking questions no one wants to answer. And maybe that's the real cost of victory, not the silence, but the echo.